We decided to hold the policy rate today because we are seeing clear evidence that higher interest rates are slowing the economy and that's cooling inflation. But we did leave the door open to higher interest rates if needed. We expect inflation to ease gradually and return to the 2% target in 2025. But we're worried that higher energy prices and persistence in underlying inflation are slowing progress.
Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem there today explaining why the central bank decided to hold its key lending rate at 5%. But there is a catch for anyone or any politician feeling some relief. Macklem also says he does not expect inflation to reach the 2% target until 2025 now. And the impact of higher prices for longer was the subject of a lot of debate on Parliament Hill. Have a listen.
He's very determined to avoid discussing the growing evidence of the link between his deficits and the inflation Canadians pay.
Mr. Speaker, what the Leader of the Opposition is proposing is to cut spending and supports for Canadians in the hopes that Canadians will somehow do better that way. We disagree.
2 million Canadians had to use the food bank in 1 month alone. This is a direct result of Liberals and Conservatives who continue to search and distract from what's going on, when the real reason of what's causing this, Canadians know really well. When they were asked the question, greedy CEOs.
Here to help us unpack what you just heard is our front bench. Elliot Hughes is a political commentator and senior associate with Summa Strategies. He's a former senior advisor to Liberal finance and defense ministers as well. Shakir Chambers worked in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office before becoming a policy advisor to the international trade minister. He's now principal at Earnscliffe Strategies. Anne McGrath is national director of the NDP, and next to her, Marika Walsh is a senior political reporter with the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Hi. Good to see you tonight. Shakir, I'll start with you. We have kind of convened on previous instances when the Bank of Canada releases its interest rate decision, and collectively everyone said it's tough for the government right now, but time is on their side, right? The fact that the election is a few years away. I found the comment today, the revised projection for reaching target for inflation, really interesting in that respect, because if in fact higher inflation does persist, I know it's not as high, but higher inflation does persist, what are the implications politically, do you think, for the government of that?
I think politically it does give the NDP some leverage. I think the Liberals are not going to want to pull the plug and go to an election anytime soon. And I think to stay in that agreement, the NDP can ask for more, right? It can push kind of the supply and confidence agreement to get the things that they want to get from the Liberals. From what I understand, Anne can speak better to it, but they want to kind of tout these policy wins in the next election. So I do think it gives some wind in the sails of the NDP, but I think for the Conservatives, listen, as long as we're talking about the economy in any context, the Conservatives are doing well. You look at polling across the board, they're viewed as the strongest with economic management. So whether inflation is high, cost of living is high, depending on how the Liberals address this, as long as we're talking about this topic, I think it bodes pretty well for the Conservatives and Peter Poilievre.
Let's pick up on the first part of Shakir's point, Anne. Do you think this does, as one of the architects of that deal, does it give the deal more weight? Is there more leverage for the NDP if, in fact, we know that inflation will remain stubborn for a longer period of time?
Well, I do think it's true that there are a variety of factors that would indicate that it would be bad timing for the Liberals to go into an election. There's their polling numbers. There's this latest thing from the Bank of Canada about how long this is going to go on for. There are a lot of there's the internal divisions in their caucus. There are a lot of things that would indicate that this is not the best time for them to go to an election. So I'm sure that that's a big part of their calculation. I would say, however, that on the Bank of Canada thing, we have to remember that while people may be a little bit relieved that there was no interest hike today, people are still reeling from the last 10. Yeah. So there's a big impact on people, and the door was left wide open to future ones. So I think that that's a big problem.
It was, and I think also just jumping off what Anne says, Marika, they're not only reeling now, and I think that statistic from the food bank that the Food Banks Canada put out today is like gutting, right? 2 million people. A third of them are kids right now. 600 and somewhat thousand of the people who accessed the food bank in March of this year were kids. But combined with that, it's not just that they're already reeling from those interest rate hikes. There's still a whole bunch of them who have to renegotiate their mortgages, whose mortgages come up. And economists keep telling me the real damage of that has yet to even be felt.
That's right. We haven't yet felt the pain of all the hikes that have happened yet. And so I think while some in the Prime Minister's office might breathe a small sigh of relief from the rate holding, at least today, and not going up as was sort of floated a few weeks ago, there's other things in that report that make them very nervous, including the fact that the path for a soft landing for the economy has narrowed, the fact that there's a higher likelihood of rough economic waters, which, don't mix well for a government that's already low in the polls, already struggling to get ahead of things, to get on top of its message for Canadians. And I think so far the government has struggled to figure out its message. Whether that gets sharpened up with the fall economic update later, maybe we'll see. But the Prime Minister's response to questions about food banks, for example, today was the fact that they have a dental program and $10 a day childcare, and that does not put food on the table. And so I think this is the challenge of being in government right now, because it's just never enough.
The messaging is, I think, picking up on what Marika said, Elliot, the messaging is so interesting to me because I do think, to be fair to the government, there are programs around the Canada Child Benefit, the daycare program, dental care, which was part of the agreement with the NDP, that actually has had an impact on poverty rates in a substantial way. The problem, as Marika outlined, is 2 million people are still going to the food bank. 17% of them are employed, which is 6% higher than any time previously. So even when people have jobs, they're at the point where they need to access a food bank to put food on the table. And I wonder if you think the government's messaging has to evolve beyond look at what we've already done, which is not to take away from it, but to more fully recognize the problem as it does stand.
Yeah, I mean, this is the conundrum the government faces. In a way, they need to continue spending to support the people who need it most, but that continued spending could lead to, further deficits, further debt, and potentially even drive inflation further, as Mr. Poilievre is making the point in question period. So it is a tough spot for the government, but I think it's important to remember that today is actually this is good news. It's good news for consumers. It's good news for the government. Good news for consumers because mortgages and loans, that those rates stop going up. Not to say that more pain isn't potentially coming, but you could make the case that this is sort of that start of a potential recovery, a recovery that will be long and has more pain in it. But for a government that I think has been really on the back foot and fighting this narrative and fighting and really taking bullets, so to speak, for the interest rate hikes by the bank, this is the start of, okay, we've stopped those raises. Yes, the outlook has been pushed out a little bit to get back to that 2% band. But at least now we can start thinking about, okay, when can we maybe start reversing those interest rate rises and so on. 2024 was never going to be an election year for the Liberals, in my opinion. It was going to be a tough economy no matter what. This just further confirms that 2025 is when the next election is most likely to take place.
Shakir, do you think if, in fact, I was speaking to one economist today who said, even though the bank kind of was signaling that there wouldn't be any decreases in rates anytime soon, they kind of have to do that to affect public sentiment. But he did expect, somewhere in the second half of 2024, those rates could start to abate. Do you think if they do, that would change the potential conversation politically or weaken the impact the Conservatives are having on this issue, or is the damage already done?
I think for the Liberals, the damage has been done. I think their hope right now is the fall economic statement. Coming out of the summer, they wanted to change the narrative, talk about the economy, as Francois Champagne said, in solutions mode. So here is your first opportunity. I think people are giving them one last chance. Show us what you can do. And to Elliot's point, they need to make a decision. How do they reconcile this need for potential new program spending with, fiscal restraint? We're in this kind of new economic reality. What do they do moving forward? The Liberals, more than anybody else, are eager, if not desperate, to show Canadians that they're listening and they're going to respond to these kind of economic hard times, financial hard times. So I'm just curious to see what they roll out in their fall economic statement, because I do believe if things don't start to improve in some way, we're heading into the holiday season. Folks are going to be out there trying to buy gifts for their nieces, their nephews, their family. I think these hard times and these economic hardships are going to be more pronounced, more consistently in this period of the year. So if there's no real measures to kind of help people with pocketbook issues, I think this might be the last gasp and the last hope for the Liberals on the economic front.
Just really quickly on that before we switch gears, and your thoughts on, I guess, putting forward a fall economic statement that does exemplify a lot of restraint when they do have the NDP asking for way more being done on pharmacare. Like, are they going to be able to reconcile those two things?
Well, it's also, I mean, there's also, it would be contradictory to their messaging up till now. It would be a bit of a shift for them.
To show fiscal restraint? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, this has not been the hallmark.
That may be the understatement of the year, yeah.
It's not been the hallmark of this government. So I think that they are, to be fair to them, I will say that they are showing a little bit more fight lately. And,
yes,
and I think that that's to the good, for sure. And they're probably benefiting somewhat from some of the conservative premiers in the country and the things that they're doing.
Well, fancy that you mentioned that, because the other subject that I wanted to talk about was something that happened today around the Canada Pension Plan. We know for a while Alberta, the premier of that province, has been talking about the possibility that Alberta withdraw from the CPP. Their most recent analysis that they presented publicly showed that they would be claimed that they would be entitled to more than half of the fund as it exists, $334 billion. Well, the Prime Minister last week wrote to Premier Smith saying, don't do it, basically, warning her away from it. And this morning, Ontario's Finance Minister, Peter Bethlenfalvy, came out to say, hey, Finance Minister Freeland, please call a meeting of all of us across the country because you need to stop this from happening. Have a listen to Minister Bethlenfalvy.
Our government firmly supports the Canada Pension Plan, and we believe Alberta's proposal could cause serious harm over the long term to working people and retirees in Ontario and across Canada.
The finance minister, the federal finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, just moments ago said that she would convene that meeting. What kind of a political battle is this shaping up to be in your view?
Well, it's shaping up to be pretty one-sided when Pierre Poilievre is on side with Justin Trudeau on something like the CPP. I think that shows you where the next election campaign is. It's not in Alberta, but it also, I think, raises more questions for the Alberta premier on what the strategy is. When Conservative premiers like Doug Ford are jumping on the bandwagon to raise the flag on this and using it to distract from their own issues at home. I think it's interesting to me that I'm imagining that Freeland would be quite keen to have this meeting because it's, I think, something that the Liberals see as something they can be on their front foot on rather than their back foot. Distracts from their issues internally right now, and it also helps Doug Ford distract from the other issues at Queen's Park.
Often I try, Elliot, to make sense of why certain politicians are pursuing certain policies, and I've certainly attempted to think through why this would be something Danielle Smith is putting in the window right now. And it's difficult to come to a conclusion just based on public opinion polling in Alberta, which the overwhelming majority of people there are not in favor of this idea, but also because she just came off an election, right? There's not really anything she needs to distract from. Her popularity is not terrible at the moment, and she's not heading into an election anytime soon. What do you think may be motivating this?
I really wish I knew. I really don't know why. I don't understand. People are not in favor of it in Alberta. Generally, I would imagine the Canadians are not in favor of it, just the damage that it would do. It raises a bunch of unnecessary questions for her. Again, I'm really grasping at straws as to why she's pursuing this. So we'll have to see. One thing that Marika just said, and maybe this is just sort of zagging just for zag's sake, but I wonder. Sure, I think Chrystia Freeland has the Ontario government behind her, and likely others and Canadians with her on this one. But I do also think, to Anne's earlier point, I think the Liberals have a little bit of wind in their sails on a few points, whether it's the housing measures, the incompetent job on the Middle East file. I think, in a way, having to distract from focusing, as Shakir says, on the issues of the day, the economic issues that matter to Canadians, and having to distract her with, a discussion with premiers about the CPP. Sure, there's some challenges on the economy, but I think with the fall statement coming up, the government and Minister Freeland particularly wants to be seen as focusing on issues like the economy that matter to Canadians. And while CPP you could argue is that and relates to pensions, I think they want to be laser focused on affordability measures. And so while I'm sure she'll take the meeting and she'll feel comfortable at the meeting that most people will be against where Alberta is standing, I also think that it's a little bit of a distraction for the government at a time when I think they were just picking up some steam.
Why do you think, Shakir, Ontario came out the way it did and the time and when it did, basically? Why did the minister do this now, do you think?
I think Marika was spot on. It's a channel changer, right? You're knee deep in controversy with the Greenbelt, land planning issues. Change the channel to something very positive. Who doesn't want to hear that you're protecting their money, their pocketbook, looking after their pension? So I think it's a smart pivot for the Ontario government to get away from those issues. But on the Danielle Smith piece, I would say, so she hasn't said there's going to be a referendum. There's still going to be a report coming out. But I think for her, we talk about the importance of communications in politics. She can leave this with some very strong narratives that play well to her party, right? This notion that she said for quite some time that Alberta is treated differently from Quebec. I know Quebec was never in the CPP, but if Alberta wants to do something, they face opposition from the federal government or from other provinces, which is unfair, right? This notion that she continually fights with Ottawa. I mean, the CPP is only one front. There's clean energy regulations. There's obviously the carbon tax. It was just impact assessment. So she has that narrative as well. I think the third piece, if she really moves forward with those numbers, Alberta gets 54% of the CPP and over $300 billion. Yeah. It's this notion that Alberta contributes disproportionately to the federation. And because of that, let us build our natural resources. Let us build our oil and gas because it's fueling Canada in areas that matter. So I think for her, there are some strong narratives to move forward that plays very well with her political base back in Alberta.
It's a good point around the sentiment that maybe underpins whatever is motivating the Premier, Anne. I would say, though, just having been in Alberta a few days ago, I think that there is a delineation for a lot of the public there between issues around natural resources and a lot of other jurisdictional issues in Alberta where they do feel the federal government is overreaching, and maybe the CPP where they're getting a bit nervous about the prospect of this or the likelihood of Alberta being able to secure half of the fund.
Well, I think that, first of all, this is Danielle Smith. I mean, you spent a lot of time in Alberta. We saw her for a long time before she became Premier. And I think her campaign team did a very good job of keeping her kind of damped down during the campaign. But whoever is around her now is just letting her go forth with all of these far-out ideas that she's heard over the years and talked over the years with on the radio program that she had, which was a bit of a cesspool of really weird ideas. So I think that this is her. This is who she is. And the other thing on this, of course, is that she does have a nascent sort of very far-right group called Take Back Alberta that has been trying to take over nomination meetings and electoral district associations. And she's going into an annual general meeting, which is a difficult place for any Conservative Premier in Alberta these days.
Valid point.